What if every vote you cast in elections is essentially permission for your own subjugation? What if the system we consider to be humanity's greatest political achievement is merely a tyranny with more skillful marketing? This is the moment that shattered illusions. When millions of Americans watched the results of the 2016 election, something broke. People who had trusted the democratic process for decades suddenly began to doubt whether ordinary citizens could handle political power. The cognitive dissonance was harsh and stark. But this crisis of faith was not new. More than 2,000 to 400 years ago, Plato witnessed the execution of his mentor Socrates by a democratic mob and came to a chilling conclusion. Democracy does not free people from tyranny. It makes tyranny seem like freedom. Modern psychology has confirmed Plato's warnings in alarming ways. Solomon Asch's experiments in the 1950s showed that 75% of people would deny obvious facts to avoid contradicting the group. If we cannot trust ourselves to determine which line is longer when the answer is clear, how can we trust millions of strangers to choose our leaders? But here is what should truly concern you. In 2006, researchers from Emory University conducted brain scans on voters who supported political parties, while they processed information about their preferred candidates. When they encountered clear evidence contradicting or failing their candidates, the areas of the brain associated with logical thinking did not show increased activity, while emotional circuits lit up. The subjects did not merely ignore unpleasant facts. Their brains physically rewarded them for avoiding cognitive dissonance. Your brain is literally programmed to love democratic manipulations, and this is how the system maintains control. To understand why modern democracy functions as a polite dictatorship, we must first acknowledge what it does right. Democracy promises something psychologically irresistible: the feeling that you matter, that your vote counts, that complex social issues can be solved through collective wisdom. Compared to open tyranny, secret police, censorship, and brutal repression, democratic systems offer genuine improvements in human dignity and individual freedom. But here is what Plato understood, and we have forgotten. The most effective control does not feel like control at all. Democratic systems have perfected what authoritarian regimes could never achieve: mass participation in our own subjugation while feeling like full participants in the process. Consider how this works psychologically. Traditional dictatorships create resistance through obvious oppression. People know they are being controlled and develop underground networks, secret codes, and revolutionary movements. But democratic systems channel dissent into sanctioned avenues. Elections, protests, petitions that provide psychological relief without threatening real power structures. This is the psychological mastery of what political scientist Stephen Levitsky calls competitive authoritarianism. When you vote against the current authorities, it may feel like you are fighting the system, but in reality, you are merely confirming the very structure that limits your choices. As Plato noted, the heaviest punishment for refusing to govern is being under the power of someone worse than yourself. However, democratic systems conceal from you how much your rulers fall short of your expectations, because you chose them yourself. Your brain craves autonomy and rationality in decision-making. Democracy creates an intoxicating illusion of both aspects, while all significant options serve the same interest. The system always wins, yet you continue to play, because every bet seems like your choice. One of Plato's most insightful observations was his understanding of how democratic freedom ultimately destroys itself. In his Republic, he described the precise sequence. Democracy generates cognitive overload, which leads to a need for simplification, granting power to demagogues, which results in tyranny disguised as the will of the people. Modern neuroscience explains why this process is nearly inevitable. When faced with an excess of information, your prefrontal cortex, responsible for critical thinking, becomes overloaded and shuts down. Your limbic system takes over, making decisions based on emotions and instincts rather than analysis. Let us call this choice overload. Too many options paralyze the ability to make sound decisions and create a need for confident authorities who promise to solve all problems. The trajectory of Venezuela perfectly illustrates this. Hugo Chavez did not seize power through military force. In 1998, he received 56% of the votes, promising relief from the confusion of Venezuelan politics. Citizens did not choose tyranny. They sought psychological comfort. When they realized what had happened, their emotional attachment to Chavez made acknowledging their mistake almost impossible. This same scenario is unfolding now across the globe. Country by country, voters are choosing leaders who promise to reduce their cognitive load, thinking for them, making decisions for them, taking responsibility for outcomes they no longer wish to resolve themselves. This reveals a fatal flaw in democracy. It systematically rewards leaders who know how to win elections, not those who can govern effectively. These are entirely different skills that often contradict each other. The psychological traits that make a person appealing to voters, such as confidence, simplicity, and emotional expressiveness, are in direct opposition to those required for effective governance, such as humility, complexity, and analytical thinking. Plato reflected this in his metaphor of the ship of fools. Imagine a vessel where passengers vote on navigation decisions. An experienced navigator understands the patterns of winds, currents, and celestial navigation, but sounds uncertain when explaining complex maritime issues. Meanwhile, charming passengers confidently promise smooth sailing and good weather, ignoring the navigator's warnings as overly panicky and elitist. Who do you think the passengers will choose, and what will happen to the ship? Plato's solution, where philosophers are granted power for their wisdom rather than popularity, may seem naive until you remember how we regard experts in other fields. We do not vote on medical procedures, engineering projects, or scientific theories. We rely on those who have spent decades mastering complex knowledge. However, in politics, competence becomes a burden. True specialists tend to express doubts, acknowledge complexity, and their ignorance on matters outside their expertise. This triggers, as psychologists say, a rejection of uncertainty in people. We prefer confident answers, even if they are incorrect. The financial crisis of 2008 illustrates this dynamic perfectly. Economists who understood the nature of bubbles in the real estate market warned of unsustainable debt levels for many years. But their warnings seemed academic and uncertain. At the same time, individuals without economic education confidently claimed that housing prices would rise forever. The market favored confidence over competence until reality intervened catastrophically. This pertains not only to the psychology of the individual, but also to how democratic institutions systematically reject expertise. Consider a person willing to spend years on a campaign, raising funds and making promises they know they cannot keep. Such actions require certain personality traits, such as narcissism, a tendency to manipulate, and tolerance for cognitive dissonance, which are often incompatible with genuine wisdom or competence. Look at your current political leaders. Are they the wisest and most competent people you know? Or are they the most ambitious, the most persuasive, ready to tell you what you want to hear? Plato's philosopher rulers were not meant to be ideal leaders, but rather those who understood the nature of power. They craved it. As Marcus Aurelius reflected in his Meditations, how many problems does one avoid by not paying attention to what his neighbor says or does? True leadership requires a focus on issues, not on popularity. This is something that democratic systems make almost impossible. Plato's allegory of the cave is not just a philosophical metaphor, but a technical guide for understanding how modern information systems shape democratic consciousness. We are all glued to our devices, observing carefully curated shadows that algorithms select for maximum engagement and minimal discomfort. But here is what makes modern democratic governance more complex and challenging than anything Plato could have imagined. The shadows are personalized. Your social media feed, news sources, and recommended content are tailored to reinforce your existing beliefs, creating the illusion of conscious choice. You are not just seeing the same shadows as everyone else. You are viewing shadows created specifically for your psychological profile. With the rise of data analytics, something even more troubling has been revealed. By using psychological profiles based on data from Facebook, political manipulators could target individuals with customized messages designed to exploit their specific psychological vulnerabilities. For instance, people prone to fear received fear-based content that made them feel special and informed. Depressed individuals were fed information that confirmed their negative perceptions of the world. This was not traditional propaganda aimed at everyone. It was a personalized psychological attack, tailored specifically for you. This creates what psychologists call a confirmation bias in an intensified form. In the past, political propaganda required everyone to see the same information. Modern democratic systems allow people to choose their own individualized reality while feeling more informed than ever. As a result, unprecedented political polarization arises, accompanied by absolute certainty in the correctness of one's position. During major political events, individuals consuming different information do not just disagree on political opinions. They literally experience different realities, see different facts, listen to different expert opinions, and have different moral frameworks for understanding the same events. Both sides feel completely informed and morally superior, while they are systematically manipulated by forces they do not even recognize. This is happening to you right now. While you are watching this, algorithms are studying your preferences. Political actors are creating communications for your demographic group, and your information environment is being customized to influence your thoughts and behaviors in ways that you may not even notice. This is why fact-checking does not work, and political debates seem increasingly futile. When individuals encounter information that contradicts their individualized reality, they do not change their minds. They experience what psychologists call the backfire effect and become even more convinced of their original position. Plato predicted this dynamic. They see him as their sworn enemy, the one who tells them the truth. In democratic societies, those who speak the truth are not silenced through censorship. Instead, they are marginalized through algorithmic suppression and social rejection. It is not necessary to ban the system or the way of thinking. It is enough to make it socially uncomfortable and psychologically burdensome. The Weimar Republic may be the most striking example of how democratic psychology can lead to tyranny. Germany in the 20s and early 30s of the last century was a functioning democracy with strong civil liberties, competitive elections, and active political debates. However, when economic crisis and political instability caused cognitive overload, German voters did not resist authoritarianism. They welcomed it. The rise of Adolf Hitler illustrates something important about the vulnerability of democracy. People do not choose tyranny out of a love for oppression. They turn to it when freedoms become psychologically unbearable. When your frontal cortex is overwhelmed by complexities and uncertainty, the limbic system takes over, craving simple and emotional solutions. The success of the Nazi Party in elections was not a result of appealing to the worst instincts of people, but rather offered liberation from the exhausting burden of democratic choice. Hitler promised to take care of all concerns: the economy, foreign policy, social issues, so that ordinary Germans could stop worrying about matters in which they did not consider themselves competent. This scenario has repeated throughout history because it exploits fundamental aspects of human psychology rather than temporary political circumstances. The ancient Athenians executed Socrates not out of unique cruelty, but because his questions forced them to confront their own ignorance, which democratic systems systematically avoid. Similarly, the transformation of the Roman Republic into an empire followed the predicted scenario by Plato. Roman leaders discovered that they could gain more power by appealing directly to the popular assemblies, rather than proving their competence through traditional institutions. Politicians like Julius Caesar found it more effective to demonstrate psychological appeal than administrative capabilities. The psychological allure was similar to modern populism. Complex problems are solved in simple ways, there are clear enemies to blame, and charismatic leaders promise to fight for the people against corrupt elites. The fact that these leaders themselves were part of the elite did not matter. What was important was the emotional creation of a sense of representation and power. Look around. How many democracies today face this dynamic? How many nations choose strong leaders who promise to think for them, to make decisions for them, to take responsibility for complex problems they no longer wish to confront? The idea that effective governance may require shared myths to maintain social cohesion persists. Critics often cite this as evidence against anti-elitist thinking, but they overlook something important. Every political system relies on fundamental myths about legitimacy, progress, and purpose. The difference lies between the noble lie of Plato and the functions and limitations of governance. Democratic systems propagate myths spontaneously through the chaos of competing interests, narratives, and mass psychology, without any accountability for their accuracy or consequences. Consider some of the core democratic myths, such as the belief that every citizen's opinion deserves equal weight, that complex social problems can be solved through electoral processes, and that majority rule leads to wise outcomes. Political leaders often represent the interests of their constituents rather than their own ambitions. These representations are not always false, but they are not entirely true either. Their aim is to make participation in democracy meaningful and morally justified, rather than to explain how their systems actually function. The problem with democratic mythology is that it hinders an honest acceptance of political reality. Instead of acknowledging the inevitable compromises, conflicts, and limitations of any governing system, democratic cultures promise the impossible: freedom without responsibility, choice without consequences, representation without influence, and liberty. When reality does not align with these promises, what arises is what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, an uncomfortable tension between beliefs and experience. Instead of adjusting unrealistic expectations, people typically blame specific leaders, parties, or groups, while continuing to believe in the system itself. This creates a perpetual cycle of disappointment and blame, which shapes the reality of democratic societies. Understanding democracy as polite dictatorships requires studying not only psychological manipulation, but also institutional arrangements. Democratic systems appear to distribute power widely, but in reality, they concentrate it in less visible forms. Let us examine how modern democratic governments actually function. Elected officials take charge of key political areas, such as monetary policy, regulatory frameworks, and international agreements, while being guided by unelected bureaucrats, technical experts, and international organizations, which are largely insulated from democratic pressure. For example, in the European Union, the European Commission, an unelected body, holds significant power, while the directly elected European Parliament wields considerably less authority than many citizens assume. National leaders campaign on domestic issues, but once in power, they often find themselves bound by supranational rules that they cannot change. Thus, voters are offered a human deficit. Important decisions are made by individuals who are not accountable to the voters, while elected officials, theoretically answerable, have limited influence on the outcomes that truly affect the lives of citizens. Meanwhile, the visible aspects of democratic governance, such as campaigns, focus on substantive policy. Citizens feel deeply engaged in political processes that, for the most part, are theatrical, while real power operates through channels they barely recognize. This organizational structure serves multiple psychological functions. It provides emotional satisfaction from political participation, while simultaneously ensuring, among other things, it creates legitimate channels for expressing dissatisfaction and frustration, directing this energy into predetermined pathways. Most importantly, it makes people feel responsible for outcomes they do not actually control. When democratic governments make unpopular decisions, citizens blame themselves for the wrong choices. When politicians fail, there is usually a call for more democracy, more participation, more transparency, more competition in elections, instead of examining whether democratic processes can structurally lead to better results. This is the genius of the system. It makes you complicit in your own powerlessness, which can accept criticism from Plato. We must acknowledge its limitations and consider the strongest counter-arguments to democratic theory. For example, Joseph Schumpeter's competitive theory of democracy does not claim that voters make wise political decisions. There is a certain logic in this theory. Democratic systems indeed create mechanisms for the peaceful transfer of leadership. institutional checks on power, and feedback loops between rulers and the ruled. Even imperfect democratic processes can prevent the worst forms of tyranny, making it difficult for one individual or group to consolidate permanent control. There are democratic examples where democratic systems have resisted demagoguery and made complex, long-term decisions. The Marshall Plan, for instance, required American voters to support costly international aid programs with unclear immediate benefits. Environmental regulations are often enacted despite short-term economic costs, prioritizing governance over popularity. However, these counterexamples do not refute the fundamental insight of Plato and democratic psychology. They merely show that a retreat from democracy to tyranny is not inevitable, but rather probable. The psychological vulnerabilities that Plato identified remain real and persistent threats in the form of philosopher kings. How can we identify and choose truly wise leaders? How can we prevent philosopher kings from being corrupted by power or isolated from the people they govern? How can we guarantee that claims to wisdom are not simply sophisticated forms of personal gain? Plato himself seemed to realize this thought experiment for understanding political psychology rather than as a practical model for reform. So what do we do with this uncomfortable knowledge? How do we live sincerely within systems that we recognize at their core as manipulative? Plato's answer did not involve a rejection of political engagement, but rather an approach with the right understanding. This means participating in democratic processes as a conscious participant rather than an unconscious victim. Instead of expecting democracy to be what it is not, a system that translates popular wisdom into effective governance, we can appreciate its preservation of relative social stability. This does not solve the fundamental problems of democratic governance, but it changes your attitude toward political participation. When you understand how your mind is manipulated by confident leaders, emotional appeals, and tribal identity, you can develop some resilience to these influences. If you understand how democratic institutions channel discontent into harmless outlets, you can think more strategically about where to direct your energy. Most importantly, awareness allows you to engage in political systems without becoming their psychological slave. You can vote, speak out, and participate while maintaining a critical distance from the mythology that makes these actions seem more significant than they actually are. It is not about becoming cynical or withdrawing from civic life. It is about more informed participation with a full awareness of the psychological mechanisms at play in this process. Psychological character shapes its citizens. If he was right, then the democracy we get is the one we deserve. Not because of our virtues, but because of our cognitive limitations and emotional needs. We want to feel informed without doing the hard work of learning. We want to feel knowledgeable without doing the hard work of learning and addressing emotional needs. We crave simple answers to complex problems, confident leaders in times of uncertainty, and someone to blame when things go wrong. Social systems provide us exactly that. A sense of political participation without its essence is the dynamic. The first step is to overcome it. When you stop expecting democracy to be what it is not, you will have the opportunity to engage with it on a more strategic and less emotional level. Understanding your psychological weaknesses will help you build resistance to manipulation. Right now, while you are watching this, the same tactics are at work in Venezuela and many other countries, and they are operating in your own state. A personalized information war that turns neighbors into enemies is thriving in your social network. Excessive variety of options, which makes people crave authoritarian simplicity, overloads your cognitive ability every day. Demagogues are already among us, promising freedom along with themselves. They gain support not because people are evil, but because people are tired. Tired of the psychological burden of democratic participation. Tired of choices they feel incompetent to make. Tired of the responsibility of self-governance. The question is not whether modern democracy functions. He observed this in ancient Athens, predicted that it would repeat throughout history, and his ideas perfectly fit our contemporary situation. The only difference is that our democratic illusions have become more sophisticated, psychological manipulation more subtle, and the need for uncomfortable self-awareness more pressing than ever. Your brain wants you to reject this message because it threatens your comfortable beliefs about the system in which you live. This reaction is precisely what Plato spoke about. The ability to think beyond this reaction is the first step toward true freedom. Mindless democracy is not worth preserving, and a mindless citizen is not truly free. The most dangerous tyranny is the one that appears to be freedom, and your brain is inclined to love it. Question your assumptions, seek uncomfortable truths, confront the ugly realities, but only reality can set you free. The cave is cozy, the light is harsh, but the choice to step into the light still remains yours, for now.